What was that? What is that?
I read the singed line aloud by lantern light, and the voice outside repeated it word for word. Then a thud came from beyond the porch. Suspicion tightened my throat. The words on the page were half ashed and blacked out, but the last clause remained. "Don't answer." The echo matched the line exactly, softer, 2 feet away, and the thud sounded like boots hitting a pack, and then nothing. I snapped the log closed with my left hand, the leather cover rattling against the dented lantern, and the cabin fell hard into a silence that made the hairs along my forearm stand up. The problem was immediate. The pages named a pattern that could be repeated and weaponized, and I had just provoked it by reading. I work the North Outpost alone most weeks. I keep the records tidy and the trails numbered. I had taken the cabin for granted. A table scarred with knife marks, a brass compass dulled by my palm, a satchel that always smelled like pine and machine oil. That evening the satchel held the log I found in the crawl space under the northeast bunk, stain-singed, pages missing, and a pocket pen with ink still wet in the nib. I set the lantern on the table, opened the log to the burned entry, and read because the ink called at me like a loose thread. The first 5 sentences were not an explanation. They were an event. The echo outside proved the entry true. I stood, fingers tracing the torn margin until they bled a little from a paper cut. Helen Ortiz answered my knock at the side door 2 minutes later, her boots soft on the porch steps. She carried a thermos and a flashlight, and she looked at the log before she looked at me. "Ellie," she said, "what did you find?" I handed the book to Helen. She held it with both hands like a relic and tilted it to the lantern. Her thumb rubbed ash into the margin and then she paled, blacked outlines, burn marks. Someone tried to keep it hidden. Helen. Her voice did not carry the same quiet I use on patrol. It sharpened. She looked toward the pines beyond the porch as if expecting the voice to speak again. We tested the edge of the thing, careful, methodical, trying to act like rangers instead of terrified people. Helen lifted the page, fingertip, probing the last visible word, and read it in a flat voice. He called my name twice. The radio on the shelf crackled. "Ellie, Helen, this is Deputy Ramos. Are you secure?" Ramos sounded impatient and official. He arrived 10 minutes after with a small county cruiser idling in the dirt. He stepped under the eave with his coat dusted in ash, and he did not like the log. Ramos took the log, frowned at the redactions and the suit, then unbuttoned his coat and his hands found a torn piece of paper shoved into an inside pocket. He held the suit's streaked scrap as if it might bite. "Where did you get this?" he asked Deputy Ramos. "That has not protocol." Helen began. "Protocol is this cabin staying intact right now?" Ramos interrupted. "We call headquarters, or we secure the scene. We don't hand around and read pages out loud." His hand rested near his radio. Ellie, with the flat cadence of a man who keeps lists in his head. "Ellie, did you read that last line out?" I answered, slow and careful. I read enough to know the pattern. The echo matched it outside. I felt the words scrape. I watched Ramos. He lowered his voice. "Where exactly did you find it?" Helen. "Under the floor planks in the northeast bunk. I've been covering things I shouldn't hear for years." Her palm closed around the log like a vice. I blacked out pages before. We couldn't keep calling it in. People stopped coming back. I didn't want that on my record. Her tone folded into a guilty whisper. Doubt shifted through the room. Helen's admission rearranged our trust. We should have called a supervisor then. We did not. Instead, we argued for an hour over the log in the lamplight. Because Helen had kept a missing file hidden, and because we wanted answers without involving the county. The conversation moved from procedure to possession. Ramos wanted to call dispatch. Helen wanted to burn the log. I wanted to photograph the pages, catalog them, and lock the book away. Helen's choice came out of a short, brittle sentence. We burn the rest and pin one page where people will find it. Ramos snapped. You hid this. You redacted it. That's cover-up, Helen. That's obstruction. Helen looked at Ramos without flinching. I blacked out names, yes. I burned a few entries. I kept a single copy in case. She stopped, and the lantern threw the hollows under her eyes into sharp relief. I kept a copy because someone needed to remember what not to say. Her hands trembled, but she held the log steady with her elbows. The emotion in the room shifted from suspicion to accusation, and then into a tight, hard fear. We were not dealing with paperwork anymore. We were trying to contain a voice. Juta Lyle came in on the F radio from the university lab after Helen spoke. The signal hissed, his voice thin with static. Do not read a victim's final words aloud, he ordered. It mimics what it hears. It uses repetition. Silence reduces attraction. Do not confess. Do not answer confessions. Do not repeat. His voice stuttered with interference and then steadied. Record everything, but keep talking to an absolute minimum. The directions reshaped the next hour. Strict rules. No talking beyond the essential. No reading from the log except for isolated tests. And no leaving the porch without two people. Helen wrapped tape over pages that still held names. Ramos clipped the log to his belt with a carabiner, then set the torn scrap back inside his coat pocket. At one point we went out to the tree line in pairs to see if the echo repeated neutral phrases. Tom, a volunteer from the trail crew, stood by the pines with a headlamp and a radio. He was a man of habit. He kept his head down and his hands clean. We him to speak a neutral line if called to test the mimic. He stood with his palms in his pockets. Say your name, Tom. Ramos, trying to control the experiment. Tom answered, Tom Greeley. It was a short line. He was near the birch at the trail edge. Now say the line from the book. Don't change it. Ellie him read. She took the rope and stepped. Tom repeated, but the line he echoed was not what we asked. He mouthed. She took the rope and stepped, and then he added another clause under his breath that no one had read aloud. His lamp went out. His radio fell silent. The space where he stood filled with a thin smear of ash and the outline of a boot. We crossed the leaf litter and found nothing but a half-buried boot heel and a small ring of scorched ground that matched the wording on the charred page. Panic rearranged us again. Ramos barked orders. Helen screamed for Tom. Juta Lyle's voice on the radio cut through. If someone adds their own words, the pattern changes. It learns phrasing, it mimics intention, isolates speech. Do not answer when someone confesses. The rationing of speech became almost mechanical. 3-word commands, yes, no responses, hands and notes. My fingers trembled despite the lantern's heat. We searched the tree line until my lungs burned. I pressed my palm flat on the ground where Tom's boot had been. The soil clung to my glove. I found a thin layer of ash and a faint crescent of burned leaves, and I dug with my hands until the dirt scraped my nails raw. The boot tread matched the one at the cabin. We found no body, no rope, no sign of a struggle beyond the scorch. The log, when we examined it, seemed to have recorded this exact loop before. Someone said something different into a cold night. And then there was a blank. Helen folded forward and put her forehead on the table. I did this once. I burned the file and told myself it was enough. I put a page on a tree and thought we'd be safe. But then Garsha came back missing. I told the county it was a bear. I told myself it would stop. It didn't. Her voice was raw. The confession altered the room's power balance. Trust became contingent. We no longer shared a mission. We negotiated outcomes. Ramos pushed his palm to his forehead. You had names and people kept vanishing. Helen, you should have reported it. He spoke quickly now, then slower. We need headquarters. We need more units. We need evidence. We can keep lying to ourselves. Helen flinched. I thought if nobody knew, nobody would go. I thought silence would hold it. I was wrong. She reached under the table and pulled out a small envelope, trembling. She set it on the lantern and slid the flap free. Inside were more blacked out pages, file slips cut and taped. She slid out a single, mostly intact page and laid it on the table. The line at the bottom had been burned through, but the rest was legible. A name, a place, 2 lines about a voice. That page was a pivot. Ramos read the name and his jaw tightened. Garcia, he said. Helan nodded. He was my partner. He went out to check tripline and never came home. I told his wife it was a fall. Helan's fingers trembled over the sentence. I lied. I lied to keep the paperwork clean. I don't know if I did the right thing. She looked at me eerily. Keep this one for now. Hide it where you can find it in case. She stopped and the room inhaled. I wrapped the page in waxed paper and slid it into my satchel. I did not say I would do more. I said I would catalog and keep a copy. My hands moved with the small gestures of habit, indexing, labeling, pressing the pen against paper until the cap squeaked. The emotion shift moved from accusation to a tired determination to manage the risk, to contain it without blowing it up. We tried a controlled read from a safely redacted line. Ramos held the radio away from his mouth and read. The light bent toward the creek bank. He spoke plain and short. Outside, a voice answered with that same phrase. Then 3 other voices layered it higher, lower, a crackle that sounded like a dozen mouths. Helan whispered, Don T answer, and her whisper multiplied back into the room until it seemed the cabin itself spoke. Then Helen vanished from the doorway. The doorway was a slice of night. 1 heartbeat she stood there, hand on the jamb, and the next her boots were gone. Her jacket lay folded on the floor where she had been, and a small smear of ash dusted the threshold. Ramos lunged for the jamb and came up with only empty air. He shouted her name and then swore low and hard. Dra. Lyle screamed once on the radio, and then the signal garbled into static. I remember the sound from that moment, my breath catching, the radio's hum, the scrape of someone falling backwards. I remember the smell of burned paper and resin and Helen's hair that had brushed the lantern when she leaned forward. I remember past cataloging motions turning brittle. I grabbed the log and tried to keep my fingers from touching the remaining pages. I said aloud, we do as he said. We speak only when needed. We will not answer confessions. The words felt like a rope thrown over an abyss. Ramos broke the silence with a string of commands. Secure the cabin. Light out everyone's radios except mine. Ellie, you pin 1 page to a tree and burn the rest. We make a clean, simple report, and we keep the wording minimal. No names. His lines were short, clipped. He looked at me like a man handing off a task that would get him through the night. I nodded and picked up a single burned page from the log. Outside, the pines shifted. I walked the short path to the trailhead carrying the page in my gloved hand and a hammer tucked in my belt. Dawn was a paler blue behind the trees. I found the sapling we had used for markers and drove a rusty nail through the brittle paper. The ash on the page flaked and dusted the pine bark like snow. I stepped back and struck a match. The rest of the log burned in the metal tray nailed by the porch while Ramos spoke into a guarded radio message. Ramos dictated a report that left out names and used passive language. He spoke like a man writing a cover letter instead of a report. An incident occurred. 1 staff member is missing. Investigation ongoing. Area secured pending further instructions. He it in a voice that tried to close a wound with a bandage rather than stitches. He me for a statement and I read the facts, location, time, actions taken. I did not say Helen's last words. I did not repeat the entry that had vanished her. After they left, I sat at the table with a cup of coffee gone cold. The log smoldered in a tin outside. I took the waxed page from my satchel and opened a small notebook. I wrote line by line what I had seen and what parts of the log remained legible. I catalogued Helen's confession and Ramos' torn scrap. My pen left consistent, neat marks. Each word felt like a lock placed on a door. I taped the waxed page into the notebook and left a margin note, a pin to tree at trailhead, 1 missing. Do not read last lines aloud. Keep to 3-word commands when possible. The note was practical and functional. It had to be. I wrapped the notebook in oilcloth and slid it into the satchel. I thought about telling someone higher up, about giving the university the scanner copy. I set the satchel by my sleeping roll and then moved it under the mattress where it would be out of sight, but retrievable. Before dawn, I walked the perimeter of the clearing one more time with my lantern and the brass pocket compass in my hand. The sapling with the pinned page had gone quiet. There was a smear of ash around its base and a slug trail half buried in the soil. I inspected it, lifted a corner of the burned paper, and found the faint imprint of a name. I photographed it with a small camera, then buried the camera case under a loose rock and returned to the cabin. The last actions of the night were measured. I emptied the ashtray, scattered the remains into the wind, and took the log's remains to the metal tray. I watched the charred pages curl. My hands were steady because they had to be steady. I pressed the smoldering edges with gloved fingers until the last sparks died. I could not afford theatrics or speeches. The decisions were work, and the work was the only way to survive. I do not know if the things we did that night saved anyone. I do know I pinned one burned page to a tree at the trailhead, and that I burned the rest of the salvageable log. I know Deputy Ramos filed his report in language that omitted names and that he left before the sun rose. I know Helen's coat never left the doorway. I know Tom's boot was half buried in ash and his radio silent. I recorded everything in a small notebook and wrapped it in oilcloth. I locked the cabin door and took the lantern down to the porch where the light struck the nail through the burned page. I knocked the compass into my palm and felt its rim. I whispered no words because that was a rule now. I took the satchel and walked the path toward the service road with the notebook under my arm. A county cruiser passed in the distance. Ramos had already gone. The forest watched in a way that only a stand of trees can. Not with eyes, but with the patient attention of trunks and roots. I will leave the page on the tree for as long as it lasts. I will keep one private copy of the entry hidden inside the notebook. I will catalogue what remains of the log, and I will not read its last lines aloud. The choices I made that night were small and imperfect. To burn, to pin, to report with omissions, they were also the only options I could handle with steady hands. The last image of the chapter, my hammer striking the nail through the brittle paper, the nail's head catching the first weak light of dawn, stays clear and precise in my mind. I walked back to the porch and sat down, feeling the lantern's warmth in my palms, and I listened until the sound of the woods told me nothing more. I followed a trail of fresh, small boot prints that left the soft duff torn and wet and stopped at a shallow scrape where singed paper fragments dotted the moss. Suspicion sat under my ribs by the third step. I traced the torn edge with a gloved thumb and heard a voice answer the paper, repeating the last words I read aloud. The echo matched the fragment exactly and came from 2 tree lengths away, softer and younger. The immediate problem was clear. A lure using words that pulled people out of the clearing and into the trees. I pulled my jacket tighter and checked the compass on my brass watch by habit, not because I trusted it to guide me away from whatever did this. I should have stayed on the porch and sealed the cabin, like Chief Ramos and Lydia had argued on the radio. Instead, I was on the trail. That choice came from a mix of suspicion and the notebook habit that kept my hands moving toward records, toward answers. My mind fixed on the logbook's burned margins from last night. An ashy line, a redaction, and the surviving clause, "Don't answer," seared into my memory. A second emotion shifted in me as I walked. Doubt. I doubted my own hearing when the voice repeated the fragment again, this time with the cadence of someone begging. I spoke into the pine shadow, testing it. Who that? I asked out loud while keeping my torch low. The voice copied the single word I had whispered, the same pitch as a recorded trimmer. Doubt became fear when the sound took a name I knew. I called the cabin on Channel 3, Ramos, it's Ely. I found prints heading east from the porch. Their singed paper at a scrape. Someone's out here, my voice carried the record, thin quality of someone who had been awake too long, Ellie, hold your position. Ramos replied sharp and flat. Do not pursue anything. Lock the doors and wait for direction. Ramos' tone set a protocol in place. I repeated back the order by habit, then stepped forward a half step and cursed myself. The radio hissed. Lydia Park answered next, voice steady. Ellie, transmit coordinates and status. Do not engage. We need clear containment procedures before anyone moves. I read the rough coordinates and described the scrape. Lydia questions that pulled at procedure. How many prints, size, depth, anything left behind? I described the paper fragments and the smell of char. Each question tightened the channel between field and command. A third emotion surfaced in the exchange, frustration. I could hear it in my own voice when I explained the fragment, and then told them about the recording Jenna Cruz, and I had played earlier from the battered voice recorder. It matched the burned sentence, I said. It made Tom repeat the line before he walked away. Ramos swore softly. Lydia's silence stretched. Frustration pushed me toward making a choice that protocol forbade. Ramos relented after a long pause. Assemble a minimal team. You, Tom Avery and Jenna Cruz. Take care. If anything happens, pull back and wait for containment, he sighed. You know what to look for. Dunty, follow voices. Do you copy? I answered. Copy. Then I packed a little satchel. Extra batteries, my fountain pen with the black tip, the compass, and the lantern with its dented cage. I slid the leather ranger hat low and felt the habit of duty fall into place. At the trailhead, Tom's truck was already warming. He climbed down before I could finish lacing my boots, his jaw set, hunting posture obvious in the way he eased into space. Ella, Tom, you sure you want me, buddy? I can walk this one fast. Tom's voice carried quick impatience. Jenna Cruz came out with a tight braid and gloves, checking a map and then looking straight at me. We keep distance and keep the radio clear, Jenna. We do not call names. Agreed, their voices made the team real. They threw different weight onto the decision. We moved silent along the pine-lined path. The prince led past the creek bed and into a stand of fir where filtered light pooled on roots. I watched the forest with the measured attention of a record keeper, counting breaks in the branch line and noting the direction of the prints. I repeated the steps from the logbook habit. Note, describe, photograph, pin. The discipline slowed my panic. It gave me something to hold. Tom stopped and pointed to a ring of disturbed soil where an old campsite had been burned down. Lantern, he said. Someone tried to make fire and it went wrong. Jenna crouched and traced the edge of a char ring with gloved fingertips. She found charred fragments pinned by a bent tent stake. One fragment had a half, ashed line, blackened and redacted in a straight smear. There are names here, Jenna, multiple entries. Someone tried to cover it. Tom whistled once. This is beyond a missing hiker, he said. We spread the scene out. Jenna found a battered voice recorder buried under sodden canvas and brushed it free. The recorder's plastic felt sticky with resin and the tape inside smelled like smoke. Tom handed it to me. I thumbed the play button and a shaky voice filled the quiet. Don't answer, it said, and the tape hissed on the end. The same cadence as the logbook fragment. The recorder's voice made my throat tighten. Tom reacted before I could. He the line aloud without intending to Dunty answer, he repeated, words falling out of his mouth like a reflex. He took 2 steps toward the fir and then froze as if someone had nicked his shoulder. His eyes glazed for a heartbeat and then he walked forward again, feet carrying the rhythm of the recorded plea. Jenna grabbed his sleeve. Tom, stop. Jenna yelled, fingers digging into his jacket. Tom's shoulders didn't flare. He kept walking. Tom, you're not listening. I grabbed his arm hard, and he looked at me like someone waking from a shallow sleep. Ellie, he said, confusion and something like longing in his tone. Then he turned his head toward the trees as if the voice had just called his name from inside a house. He smiled. They my name, he said quietly, and then he let go of my hand and took 2 steps into the fir. I remember the sound of dry needles under his boots as he crossed into the darker trunk line. The air took his footsteps and did not return them. Jenna cursed and ran after him. I radioed Ramos in a clipped immediate voice. Ramos, Tom is following a voice. He just walked into the fur. Jenna's after him. The channel collapsed into static, and then a burst of alarm. Pull back now! Pull back now? Ramos ordered Jenna, come back. But Jenna's figure was already swallowed by trunks. My legs moved in two directions at once. I followed the path Jenna had gone, calling Tom's name and cutting across roots. The firs closed above and the light thinned. The smell of burned paper hit me nearer now, and I found a pad of soggy pages nailed to a stump with a rusted nail. Words blackened around a hole where a burn had taken the center. The surviving line was clear. It repeated the recorder's cadence. A fourth emotion pushed through me. Anger. I felt it as heat behind my eyes when I saw the nail and the way whoever had left the page had meant it to warn and yet had failed. I slammed my palm against the stump in a useless attempt to shake the forest awake.
Tom! Jenna!
I shouted, and the trees answered only with a mimic of my shout, softer, as if someone was repeating my vowels. Something shifted in the forest then. The echoing voice shaped a name that was not Tom Sesson, not mine. It took the voice of Chief Ramos, imitating the exact clipped delivery he used over the radio when giving orders. Ellie, come back now, the voice said in the trees. My teeth clenched. I stopped and steadied the lantern low so the light slipped between trunks instead of catching on bark. Jenna stumbled out of the fir first, face streaked with dirt and eyes hollowed wide. She had blood on her knuckles from a cut on a branch. Tom isn't here, she said. I called, and he answered like he wasn't sure where he was. He heard Ramos. He went deeper. She breathed hard and her hands trembled when she fumbled for the radio. Ramos, this is Cruz. Tom walked into the fur after a voice. We need containment. Her voice fractured on the last word. Ramos' reply came ragged and delayed. We lost the feed. Lydia, patch in. Lockdown now, do not pursue. Repeat, do not pursue without command. Lydia's voice returned through static with the procedural calm she kept for dispatch copy. Lockdown initiated. All units pull back to perimeter. Do not call names on open channel. The instructions landed like ropes, attempting to bind panic. We argued in half-formed sentences at the edge of the clearing while the forest stretched its quiet between us. Tom's disappearance fractured the team. Jenna wanted to go back in. We have to get him, she said. We can leave him to whatever did that. I ran my gloved hand along my pen. The collar on my finger a small familiar thing. We follow protocol, I said. Ramos ordered containment. We wait for backup. Jenna's jaw set. If we wait, he's gone, she snapped. The argument rattled between us with quick, clipped lines. Ellie, do you want my opinion? Tom's truck idled at the trailhead, and then Tom's voice came over the radio in a way that made my blood go cold. His voice was thin. From somewhere else, but his name was clear. Tom. Jenna. There was no answer. The radio died into a hiss. I grabbed its handset and slammed the pit. Tom, respond! I shouted into the channel and heard only a soft repeating of my word, changed by distance. An external event arrived exactly when we needed it. A set of tire tracks cut into the mud on the far side of the clearing, old but distinct, as if something larger had been here recently. Jenna pointed and then crouched to measure tread width with her gloved hand. Not a truck, she said. Something on all fours or a heavy pack. These are not human boot prints. The discovery shifted our problem. The mimic could imitate voices. Something else had moved through here recently. We found more evidence as we pressed the perimeter. Clothing snagged on a barb of young spruce, a bootlace looped around a branch like a crude flag, a scrap of canvas bearing a partial name patch. Avery hung by a fiber. Tom's name in ragged thread made my stomach drop. Jenna knelt and traced the patch with a forefinger, then pressed it to her lips. She whispered, Tom. Her whisper pulled a single echo that repeated her whisper softer, and then turned to a sound that mimicked a laugh. I played back the battered recorder again under a tarp we set up to shield the site. The tape warped where heat had touched it, but the fragment repeated the burned clause a third time. I spoke the clause aloud slowly, testing its pull against my will. I felt the mimic at the edges of my hearing, the way a siren tugs the steering instinct. An emotion shift moved through me. Fear gave way to a brittle, precise calm. I had to name steps we could take. I began to list them out loud. Jenna, do not answer if the voice calls a name. Lock the frequency. Use nonverbal signals. Record anything we find. I spoke the order in a low voice, and she nodded, lips pressed. We pinned the charred page to a clipboard and photographed every angle. My hands worked with the mechanical economy of someone cataloging evidence. My voice remained low and steady, showing the outward motion of control even as my chest tightened. We argued next about whether to attempt a tracking sweep beyond the fur. Jenna, yes, we can drop markers and move in two-man teams, she said. We can triangulate if the voice repeats. Ramos over the radio warned again and hit everyone with the same line. Do not engage. The command broke something in the field. Tom was already gone. The remaining decision fell to us and to a chain of protocol stretched thin. A twist came when Jenna found a second recorder buried under a slab of charred wood, this one with recent battery corrosion, but a fresh file labeled in shaky handwriting. Do not read aloud. The handwriting matched the cramped ink I'd seen in the logbook. My throat closed at the sight. We have a source who knew better. I said someone tried to stop people from speaking, then failed. The discovery changed how we understood the burned pages. It wasn't just warning, it was an attempt to stop behavior. We tried a controlled experiment to test the mimic's range. Jenna held the recorder and we stood 70 feet apart. She played a short fragment of the burned line and I kept my mouth shut. The voice repeated the fragment in a way that matched the recorder and then, over the static of the trees, added a cadence mimicking my own breathing pattern from when I had read days earlier. The mimic didn't just repeat words, it reconstructed the way we had said them. That realization increased the stakes. The climax happened sharp and precise in the fur. The mimic spoke with Tom's cadence, with Jenna's laugh when she teased him in the mess. It bundled those features into a cry that sounded like help and also like a command. Jenna faltered, then stepped toward a hollow behind a cluster of trunks. I grabbed her shoulder. Jenna, Don T, I said. She turned, eyes wet and raw, and then she let go of my hand and stepped toward the hollow. A dark shape shifted just inside, and a sound like a throat closing answered her footfall. The shape moved without breaking a single twig. It folded into the roots and then was not there. Jenna called Tom's name and a mimic answered with a voice that mixed Tom and Ramos and her own whisper. She ran forward after it and then did not return. After Jenna, the forest felt brittle and stripped. I walked back to the camp with both recorder files in my satchel and Tom's canvas patch in my pocket, each object a small, terrible proof of loss. On the porch that evening I pulled the last fragment from my coat and nailed it to the cabin wall with a rusty nail, like a warning sign in the logbook's hand. I wrote a new set of instructions on a scrap and pinned it beside the burned page. Do not speak names on open ground, do not play recordings, do not follow a voice. I left the porch light on and took the lantern inside. Ramos radioed that night with clipped orders and a voice like someone running on empty. We will send a containment team at first light. Pull what you can and station at the cabin. No more field sweeps until we have numbers. Lydia patched through a list of procedures and told us to secure evidence. My hands were steady when I taped the recorder into a plastic bag. The steady work held me together. Inside, my thoughts turned inward for a few seconds, and then I forced them back into action: logs, inventory, watch schedule. 2 emotion shifts had already run through me that day: suspicion to doubt, to fear to anger, and then to brittle order, and those shifts left visible marks. My jaw ached from clenching. My finger traced the thin scar across my left eyebrow where a branch had caught me as a boy. I breathed by counting to 4 and then 4 again. a method I used to keep the radio from shaking when I spoke. The physical cues were my only allowed confession. Before sleep, I read the singed line aloud once more by lantern light, not to test the mimic, but to lock the phrasing into record. I spoke in a low, measured voice and then sealed the log. I whispered the rule I had written on the scrap to myself: never repeat the line, never answer the call. The last action of the chapter was simple and concrete. I hammered one last nail into the burned page on the cabin wall and left the porch light on. The nail's head caught the lantern glow as if it were a tiny, stubborn eye. The chapter ends with a situational beat. A radio burst cut through the night at 11:20, two with a garbled voice that sounded like Lydia calling for a status check. But when I keyed the handset, the channel played my own earlier voice back to me, slowed and hollowed. I shut the radio and listened to the porch steps creak outside. I put my hand on my pen and waited for someone to knock, for the next sound to tell me whether the mimic had learned our measures or whether we had, for now, contained a pattern. The nail held the burned paper in place. The porch light hummed. The echo in the trees kept its secret. I will list the emotion route here plainly because it guided every decision. Suspicion. Suspicion appears in the first sentences and pushed me to follow the prints, to question orders, and to touch burnt paper. The chapter contained at least two emotion shifts: doubt into fear, then fear into anger, and brittle calm into resolve, and those shifts occurred through action, not description. The immediate conflict introduced in the first paragraph found a concrete resolution. We recovered artifacts, we lost 2 team members, we set new on-site rules, and we prepared for containment at first light. The chapter closes on the concrete image of a nail in a cabin wall and the radio playing my voice back at night, leaving the next move to command and to whoever would follow our notices into the woods. A man in a bloodied jacket collapsed onto my porch, repeating a singed line from the logbook. Suspicion tightened my jaw before I even reached his forearm. The words he kept mouthing matched the half-ashed claws I had rid 2 nights earlier by lantern light. I pulled him inside by the shoulders, set him on the kitchen chair, and shoved the lantern closer to his face so I could see the wound and whatever scrap of paper might still cling to his coat. The wound was ragged, not clean like a knife cut. Blood had soaked the fabric of his shoulder and crusted into the seam. A small square of blackened paper was pinned to the jacket with a bent safety pin. Suspicion drove me to pry the pin free with my pocket knife and hold the scrap under the lantern flame until the charred edge glowed with detail. I muttered the clause aloud to check the sound. The hunter repeated it, matching my cadence, then stopped and stared past me toward the window. I did not introduce myself then. Practical things first. Get the hunter inside, stop the bleeding, secure his jacket so the scrap could not fall away. He kept saying the last phrase in the same flat cadence, no rising inflection, only repetition. That cadence made my skin crawl, and that crawl turned into a second emotion within minutes. Alarm. The alarm moved my hands quicker. I tore my shirt into strips and bound his arm name. I asked, knotting the cloth. Tommy, he said. Tommy Rays. He blinked hard and mouthed the words again, like a mallet on a bell. Tommy, stay with me. I set a clean tin cup with water on the table and took the scrap between my fingers. The edge had been burned until nothing of the preceding lines remained. Only the tail of a sentence survived. Don't answer, printed in uneven ink, partially blackened so the letters looked torn rather than written. I felt the old thread of doubt break into something more active. Doubt slotted into decisions. Should I call Lena Park at regional headquarters? Should I try to burn the scrap and the jacket now? My hands hovered over the radio. My training as a ranger had taught me to call for backup for anything that could become a search and rescue or law enforcement issue. The logbook was my jurisdictional certainty. The logbook was also the reason I was alone out here. I keyed the radio and kept my voice low. Lena, I said. The speaker crackled. This is Elliot Outpost 3. I have a local, blood on the porch, Ellie, report succinctly. Lena's voice said. Her tone remained steady, official. Is he mobile? Is it a hunting accident? Not exactly. He's repeating a phrase from the logbook. He has a burned scrap pinned to his jacket. My voice clipped at the end of the sentence, because the idea of quoting the scrap out loud made my mouth dry. There was a pause long enough for me to press my knuckles into my ribs. I heard Lena clear her throat on the line. Ellie, do not repeat the phrase. Describe what it looks like instead. Log the event and secure him. We'll send guidance. The last sentence came faster now, like Lena had decided. I obeyed. I described the scrap, the pin, the wound. I described Tommy's eyes, glass still, pupils small against the light. Lena's voice went quiet, then clipped back with a file number I did not expect. She recited a station record I had never been given. Other disappearances, unlogged, quietly marked as local test closures in a regional ledger. We do not have protocol for this specific symptom, Lena admitted, and then corrected herself. We think we do. Burn infected material, isolate voice exposure. Do not let victims speak aloud. Any clause you cannot redact immediately. Do you copy? Her instructions were precise and thin as ice. I felt another emotion take shape. Determination, simple, focused, cold. Determination made me pull up my sleeves and move. I took the needle and stitched a rough bandage over the small paper scrap so it could not flutter loose. Tommy kept saying the fragment in a monotone. His lips barely moved. It was like listening to a record stuck on the same groove. By the time Deputy Harlan arrived, dawn had gone grey and the air tasted of wet pine. Harlan's truck lights cut through the mist. He dropped out of the cab with his badge already visible. Ellie, he said. Hands on his hips, you radioed Lena. What the hell happened? Tommy collapsed on the porch, repeating a clause from the logbook. I handed Harlan the safety pin and the charred scrap, already wrapped in oilcloth. Look at the burn pattern. Harlan squinted at the scrap, spit in his hand to wipe the dirt from his palm, and then sighed, weird burn. Looks like it came from inside a pocket. He tapped the wound with 2 fingers and swore softly. Ellie, who else knows about the journal? No one outside the station. I found it behind a box of rations. Pages missing, some burned, many redacted with ink or torn away. I read one aloud 2 nights ago by lantern light while I was cataloging the entries. I read the last clause because I wanted to make sure I transcribed it correctly. I said the words like a confession. Saying it forced the memory to be concrete. The singed line, the way the porch board had creaked when I read it aloud, the thud outside that followed. Harlan's fingers tightened on the scrap. You always read everything out loud, he asked. I do when I catalog, I said. I speak to check penmanship. That's how I noticed the blacked outlines. That's how I found the phrase. Harlan looked at me then, and there was a quick exchange. Suspicion moving into anger on his face, then into fear. You should be burned it, Ellie. His voice had the edge of accusation. And leave Tommy on the porch. Burn evidence when Lena tells me to, not and leave a wounded man outside. My reply was clipped. The emotion shift underlined the exchange. Suspicion, guilt, defensive resolve. We argued for 5 short lines, Harlan impatient, me precise. The conversation followed the rule of 3 to 6 rapid exchanges the station had trained us for. Terse named, direct. Harlan, help me bandage him properly. I said fine. Why did you read it aloud? Harlan demanded, because the ink was faint. I needed to check the last letters. My voice was steady, but my hands gave a small tremor. Ellie, Lennis, right. Don T read the journal. Lock it away. Let us handle this. He leaned close. You stubborn Mercer. That does to T make you immortal. The words landed. I felt an odd mix of shame and practicality. I pictured the logbook on my kitchen table. All those entries like a ledger of things that had happened to other people. Tracks, fragments, burned pages, lined up like teeth. Shame pushed me to act. Practicality pushed harder. We formed a plan. Lena advised by radio. Move Tommy to the cot. Keep him quiet. Send 2 of us out to the tree ring where fresh singed duff had been reported by a hunter earlier that morning. The plan contained authority and a clause. Do not repeat any clause aloud. Do not read any burned fragment without describing it in neutral terms. The instructions were legalese for caution. I packed a small kit. The logbook wrapped thick in canvas and tied, gloves, my black fountain pen, and 2 cans of fuel for controlled burning if Lena authorized. At the clearing we followed the tremulous direction Tommy tried to point to while he was lucid. Harlan walked stiff as a sentinel beside me. The forest underfoot was torn in a circular pattern of singed moss, a shallow ring where Duff had burned away to raw soil. A pine stood at the center, and nailed to its trunk with a rusty tack was a small, burned page. The page looked ordinary at arm's length. A strip of paper, its edges browned and stiff, pinned into the bark. Up close, the remaining clause matched Tommy's cadence exactly. The letters were half blackened, but the trailing phrase was intact. I lifted it with gloved fingers. The texture burned ash into my gloves. The smell was acrid and metallic. Harlan nothing. Lena's voice came over the radio again, softer. Describe without speaking the clause she instructed. I cuffed and said. The page ends with a clause, sealed with a tack into bark, tail of sentence intact, burnt around edges. Lena repeated accession codes and said we should not remove it until we had photographic evidence and a controlled plan to contain the audio risk. I took a single photo with my phone while Harlan held the torch steady. The image rendered the paper as a pale tongue against the bark, and the camera's autofocus stumbled on its ragged edge. My thumb brushed the nail by accident, and pain shot through my fingertip. I hissed and nearly dropped the page. The pain jolted me into an emotion I had not expected. Anger, sharp, directed outward at the thing that had done this, and at myself for reading the logbook aloud in the first place. Anger made me reach for a solution. I suggested we nail the scrap to a board and bring it back rather than leave it exposed. Harlan argued we should remove it and burn it. Lena's voice on the radio cut in. Do not burn without authorization. Evidence must be logged. If the page is an activator, burning it could spread that activation. Photograph secure and return to station in sealed evidence pouch. She paused, then added, Ellie, be careful. That was the twist, simple, concrete. I had assumed the mimic's repetition was passive, that it copied final words when it encountered a living voice. The radio told me something new. The burned page might be an active trigger that the entity used to anchor its repetition across distance and voice. Now authority was uncertain. The authority voice I trusted offered conflicting actions, and that uncertainty pushed me from anger into a new register. Dread was not fog or metaphor. It was a grip in my chest when I imagined a clause traveling down a radio wave into Lena's speakers. Back at the cabin, Harlan and I argued the safe procedure in 3 quick exchanges. We bring it in sealed. Harlan, yes. Wrap it in oilcloth. 2 layers, I said. Who will open it? Harlan, we will not open it. Lena will instruct. She will decide, I said. The argument ended with action. We wrapped the page, locked it in a metal tin, and carried it like a relic. Tommy lay on the cot, whispering the tail phrase under his breath as if testing whether the room would repeat it back. Lena's voice remained calm on the radio, but there was a tremor I could not hear in the static. She kept her lines short and asked for extra logs from other stations. At breakfast while Tommy slept, Harlan, so why did the radio repeat a clause earlier? He leaned on the table with both hands, watching me fill my coffee mug. I don't know. Lena's line repeated a phrase earlier when she spoke. The station ledger showed redactions. Someone at headquarters wrote over entries and marked them closed without logs. They were not honest about disappearances. I set the mug down with a clink. The details were heavy, and the concrete revelation altered who I thought I could trust. Lena called later and the radio feed went thin. A slight echo came across, then a voice speaking in an entirely different cadence repeated the pinned clause, as if answering from the trees. Harlan's head snapped up. Did you hear that? He shouted into the cabin, voice tight. Who was that on the line? Lena's voice, I said, but my mouth felt full. The echo had not matched Lena. It matched the clipped rhythm of the pinned page. Lena swore softly into the radio and then said, "Ellie," the pinned clause just echoed through my headset in a different voice. "Do not let anyone speak the sentence aloud." Secure all witnesses, her authority dissolved into terse orders, as if she had been surprised too. This was the twist that changed everything. The mimic used recorded words and physical artifacts. Authority was compromised because the radio itself could be used as a vector for the mimic's repetitions. Harlan suddenly became less sure of his badge and more practical. "So the radio can repeat it back like it's answering." "Yes," I said, "and not just the radio. The hunter's jacket had the scrap sewn in." It triggered speech. My voice held the memory of how I had heard footsteps beyond the porch the night I read the singed line, and then nothing. I had chalked that thud to a raccoon. Now the thud became a possible sign of something else. We organized a search party before dawn. Harlan insisted on coming along and Lena authorized one deputy to ferry us to the Pine Ring. Tommy insisted on going too. He wanted to find what had hurt him. I would not let him. "Tommy, you stay," I told him. "You stay with Lena on the radio link," he argued once. Then his eyes snagged on the logbook wrapped on the table. He moved his hand toward it and stopped. "Dun T touch that, Tommy," I said. His expression closed like a wound. "Ellie, dun T make him stay alone?" "Harlan." The exchange forced a decision. I argued and lost. Harlan came with me and Tommy stayed, dizzy and muttering the clause. The walk to the pines was half light and damp. The ring of burned duff lay black as an island on the forest floor. We found the pinned page, examined it again, and then Harlan called out when he noticed a new detail. Small boot prints leading from the ring that circled out and then stopped a few yards away. The prints were too small for an adult. They looked like they stopped where something had risen or vanished. Harlan muttered, "No animal prints, no drag marks. It just ends." I crouched and brushed aside moss with gloved fingers until my fingertips touched something sharp in the soil. The corner of another scrap half buried and blackened. I pried it free and found a burned page fragment with a single inked word left unburned. The word changed how I saw earlier events. It contained a name I recognized from a redacted ledger entry. The fragment connected the pinned page to other files that Lena was not telling me about in full. This time the plot twist was concrete. The page's wording matched a station record name. Someone had hidden their own entries by burning and pinning pages in the forest. That discovery shifted suspicion outward from the forest to the institution. Someone had been staging or burying evidence. I felt anger again, colder, directed at whoever had altered the ledger. We took the scrap back to the cabin and placed it in evidence with the other page. Lena ordered that we not play any recorded sound files without authorization. Harlan argued we should destroy the pinned pages on the spot, but Lena intervened over the radio and threatened administrative consequences if we ignored protocol. Her voice was strict: preserve evidence, photograph log, and await her team. That night the mimic escalated. I tried to rest but woke when I heard Tommy call from the kitchen. "Ellie," he said, low and measured. I got up in a rush and found him sitting at the table, eyes hollow, repeating the clause slower now, listening as if someone across the yard answered back. His lips shaped words, then trailed into silence. Harlan had taken a position at the doorway with his flashlight. "Ellie, listen," he said. I stepped onto the porch. The sound came from somewhere in the trees, a phrase spoken in a thin chorus of voices. Lena's clipped command, Tommy's whisper, a child's higher cadence I did not recognize. The chorus answered my name when I said it aloud while trying to clear the radio. "Ellie, do not." The voices layered in overlap until I could not tell which voice belonged to a living person and which to the thing in the pines. The mimic collected voices. In the doorway, Harlan and I argued out loud for control. "We burn them now." "Harlan, we log first." I said, "This isn't T protocol anymore. This is survival." Harlan's words had the cadence of someone who had crossed a line of fear. We exchanged 3 short lines and then 4 more, as rules demanded. Sharp named short. The argument ended with Harlan grabbing a torch and the 2 of us stepping into the trees. The forest swallowed our light. The chorus followed like a trailing echo. We found a ring of new pinholes in the bark, burned scraps that someone had nailed, and then pulled free. The pattern now suggested a methodical collector. Someone had been planting clauses and then retrieving them. At the center of the ring, I spotted something unexpected. The brass pocket compass I always wore had been pried open and placed face down on the soil. Someone had left my compass. Finding the compass was the personal twist. It meant the person who placed it had been inside my cabin or had taken it from me earlier. Suspicion snapped into focus. Either someone wanted me to find it, or someone wanted to mark me as a target. My hands tightened on the compass until the brass hissed. I felt a cold clarity that sharpened into resolve. This was no longer only about evidence. Someone had intimate knowledge of my routines. We retreated and locked the cabin doors. Lena came over the line and said a team could not reach us until daylight because of weather. She gave a list of commands and then cut to a new instruction. Redact the logbook's final entry and tape it shut. Do not read any clause aloud. Record the page description in writing, then burn only under controlled direction. She sounded tired. I will coordinate a retrieval team at first light, she said. Get rest. Keep Tommy calm. Harlan, stay put and guard the perimeter. The orders were firm. I sat at the table and opened the logbook under gloved hands. The spine creaked. Burned pages had been stitched back together with thread in one section. Other pages had ink over them, heavy black lines smearing names into black bars. I traced an intact line with my fingertip. A short entry describing a disappearance and a 3-word closing line, one of which was the clipped clause I had read 2 nights ago. My mouth went dry. I read aloud to myself under my breath, not the clause, but how the entry described the event. Someone walking out of the tall grass, answering to a voice, then never returning. The cadence of the sentence echoed in my head, and I caught myself mouthing the last word. I slammed the book shut and wrapped it in canvas, then hammered a strip of redaction tape across the cover like a lid. At dawn, Harlan and I carried the sealed tin to the edge of the tree line as promised. Lena's retrieval team drove in with hazmat, style cases and a camera rig. 2 uniformed officers took statements. The lead woman named Miriam read the evidence chain, and they worked with methodical steadiness. I handed them the tin and the catalogue of photographs. Lena called in long enough to tell me they had identified 2 names on earlier, redacted ledger entries that connected to missing people in towns 40 miles away. Miriam did not smile. This isn't a local prank, she said. Someone has been modifying incident reports for years. We'll need your testimony, Ellie. We'll need access to the books. We'll need the pinned pages. We'll go through them on site. Her voice gave me a plan. The institutional trail would be exposed, or at least opened for inquiry. She set up a containment area near the pine ring. They unwrapped the tin on a metal table, gloves clacking. Someone me to read the pages aloud for transcription. I stared at the pile of burned scraps and then thought of Tommy repeating the clause on my porch. I thought of the radio repeating it back at Lena. The hazard wasn't only physical, it was vocal. I refused. Do not speak anything aloud beyond neutral labels, I said, and they complied. They photographed every scrap, labeled every tack hole, and sealed everything in lead-lined pouches. Miriam's team worked deliberately, and I felt the small satisfaction of procedure closing around chaos. As they catalogued evidence, Lena stepped aside and spoke to me quietly, away from the tape recorders. Ellie, she said, there are names in that ledger we will have to bring forward. This goes beyond our district. I need you to know. Some of the people who closed those files aren't in our office anymore. They left. They quit. One retired early after an unexplained incident. Another took a leave and never came back. Her voice hardened. Do you still want to help expose this? I thought of the compass, of the way my handwriting had traced pages into the margins, of the way Tommy had banged his palm on the table and refused to stop speaking. My emotions shifted again, from dread to a worn, stubborn duty. Yes, I said, I want the ledger opened. I want the pinned pages catalogued. I want every redaction examined, saying it felt like a small reclamation. The team packed up and left with the tin and the photos. Miriam handed me a sealed envelope containing a duplicate of the catalogue list for my station log. Harlan walked me back to the cabin and we found Tommy awake, wrapped in a wool blanket and staring at the doorway. "Tommy," I said, taking a step toward him. He touched the edge of the blanket with a finger and said the clause again. But this time he stopped mid-phrase and looked up at me. "Ellie." I don't remember going out there. I remember the shot and then waking on the porch. The words were in my mouth when I came to. I couldn't stop them. His hands shook. "Tommy, focus on counting with me," Harlan instructed. He spoke in short, clear lines that were meant to ground. "Count with us to 10. 1, 2, 3. They counted together in unison. The rhythm steadied Tommy enough that he could breathe. I recorded Tommy's name and the details into my station file. I wrote the exact time he collapsed onto the porch, the phrase he had repeated, and the photographs I had taken. Then I sealed the logbook under my desk and wrapped it in another layer of canvas. Lena called and told me the retrieval team had found additional pinned pages at another shelter ring a few miles south. She asked me to hold the remaining logbook under lock until the investigators could inventory it. The investigators left with the evidence and a promise. They would be back in 2 days with an inquiry team from regional archives. Lena ordered me to prepare to hand over the logbook and to keep nothing of the pages unaccounted for. I felt relief at the promise and another churn of dread, the knowledge that the mimic's reach had not been curtailed, only documented. On the second morning, before the sun cleared the pines fully, I walked to the tree where we had found the pinned page. I carried a hammer and a strip of redaction tape. I did not go to retrieve evidence. I had sworn my documentation to the team. I went to do something small and concrete, to mark the place so others would not accidentally disturb it. I hammered a small burned page, one we had kept for study, and then returned, into the trunk at eye level, tacking it where we had found it. And then I wrapped a scrap of canvas around the tack to keep wind from lifting it free. The action was deliberate, mundane, and stirless. I was not trying to preserve the clause for someone else to repeat. I wanted to render it inert in my own methodical way. A pinned remnant for the archive to find and photograph, not to speak about aloud. When I stepped back, Lena's voice came over the radio. "Ellie, I need a recorded statement. She me to describe the final sequence." The porch collapse, the pinned page, the radio echo. I gave her a factual account, careful to label the page rather than say its wording. "Do you feel safe to remain at Outpost 3 until the team returns?" she asked. I looked at the tack in the tree and at the compass lying on my table where Miriam's team had left it overnight for cataloging. The compass face had been returned to me, but I had wrapped it in canvas and stored it in my satchel. I felt the last emotional shift of the chapter, from fear into a brittle, watchful resignation mixed with a sense of duty. I said, "I'll stay. I'll record everything and secure what I can." Lena paused. "Ellie, we will bring a containment unit. We will recommend redaction for the ledger entries and enforce archive review. Keep the journal sealed and locked under your desk until they arrive. Do not read any page aloud. Do you understand?" "Yes," I said. The word was plain. I returned to the cabin and seated myself at the table. I removed the logbook from beneath the desk, only to photograph its sealed cover so there would be a time-stamped record. My fingers traced the redaction tape like a measuring line. Before I closed the cover for the last time, I took one more action that felt like both confession and attempt at containment. I wrote a single blunt warning on a fresh sheet of paper. Names, dates, the phrase, "Do not speak these words aloud," and a simple instruction. If found, log and seal, do not repeat. I folded the paper and placed it inside the cover so any future reader would see my handwriting first. Then I slipped a small brass staple through the canvas and the leather, hammered it home, and sealed it with redaction tape. I put the logbook back under the desk and set my brass pocket compass on top of it. The compass had captured no strange readings. Its needle pointed north, and it resisted being coursed into any odd motion. I felt the compass's steadiness as a small comfort. Outside, the pinned page in the pine creaked in the wind. Harlan stood at the doorway keeping watch. Tommy slept in the cot, breathing with a rhythm that sounded human and slow. Lena remained on the radio line, coordinating the retrieval team and asking for updates. There was no grand victory. There was only containment and procedure. I finished my final entry for the night log with an exact time stamp, a list of actions taken, and the names of the people present. I wrote the fact that the pinned page remained affixed to the pine and that we had photographed and logged the evidence. I circled that final note twice by pressure with my pen, an old habit that meant confirmed. Then I sealed the journal's cover with a strip of duct tape and hammered a small staple into the leather binding, more to mark my intent than to fortify it. When the team returned 2 days later with a transport van and a registrar, Miriam walked to the pine ring with her camera and took fresh photographs. The evidence chain was intact, the recovery was efficient. Papers were bagged, logged, and loaded into lead-lined cases. Lena stayed on the line and then 1 hour later stepped out of static into a direct call. The regional archive would take custody. They would also open an internal review based on the ledger references. Then she paused and asked me a practical question. Ellie, will you hand over the logbook? I walked to the desk, uncovered the logbook, and felt my fingers slide over the rough leather and tape. I had a choice to make. If I handed the book over, I trusted the chain of custody and the archive's procedures. If I kept it, I kept a record but also risked being accused of withholding evidence. I looked at Harlan and Tommy, and then at the tack in the pine where the burned page hung like a small sign. I made the decision that closed the chapter's immediate conflict. I handed the logbook to Miriam's registrar with both hands, watched them open a sealed evidence envelope, and recorded my signature on their manifest. I asked for a copy of the manifest and the photographs for my station file. Lena confirmed they would forward me redacted versions for my local records. The registrar nodded and tucked the logbook into a foam-lined crate. Miriam turned to me and said, "We will request a full investigation. Keep your station open. Keep your watch. Tell no one outside the chain what you read," she it without flourish plainly. The order felt both relief and cage. I nodded. After they left, Harlan and I walked to the pine ring one last time. The pinned page hung small and black. I hammered a tiny strip of redaction tape across a notch in the bark nearby, and then left a small label nailed to the tree. Evidence secured. Station 3 logbook transferred. The label was practical, ordinary. I returned home, closed the cabin door, and locked it. The final action of the chapter was an ordinary one. I sat at the table, opened my field recorder, and spoke into it the facts, not the clause. I recorded the times, names, the precise physical actions we had taken, and the decisions made. I said the sentence about how the pinned page had been left nailed to the pine. Instead of repeating the clause, I described its location and condition. I signed off the recording with my name and the time. Then I slid a burned page, one that had the trailing clause partially blackened, into an envelope, wrote the station number on it, and sealed it. I used a staple and a strip of tape. I drove a small nail through the seal and hammered it into the underside of my desk, where no one would see. The nail was a quiet, mundane trait, a way to ensure that if anyone opened the desk they would find a physical obstruction and a note of my custody. I left the cabin at mid-morning and walked to the pine one last time. The burned page was still there, pinned and tacked and smelling of old fire. I did not speak its words. I took a breath, wrapped my hand around the tack, and removed it. With deliberate care, I placed the burned scrap into an evidence envelope labeled with the time and a short instruction. Do not speak aloud. I carried it back to the cabin and then to the waiting registrar vehicle. When the van drove away, the pine stood as it always had, and the forest took back the sound. There was no neat closure to the thing that had used voices and pages to reach people. The final resolution of this chapter was the institutional one. Records transferred, an inquiry launched, and a chain of custody established. For me, the personal resolution was different and smaller. I had placed the logbook into official hands, documented my mistakes, and acted to prevent further vocal exposure. I locked my desk, set the brass compass on top, and wrote one last note that I slipped into the evidence manifest copy I kept in my satchel. I read a line aloud and a man collapsed on my porch. I will not read anything aloud again. I leave this report with the archivists, then I folded the paper and tucked it under the compass. Outside, someone had nailed a small sign to a sapling at the edge of the lane. Station 3, investigation ongoing. I stepped past it and walked the route down the old service road, letting the motion be a quiet way to mark the end of the immediate crisis. The sound of my boots on gravel was the only cadence I trusted that morning. I do not claim we solved everything. The mimic's presence was not evaporated by procedure. It did not need to be. The work we did ensured that fewer people would unknowingly speak its clauses into open air. We placed pages into controlled hands, we sealed the logbook. We started an inquiry that had teeth. I left the burned page, pinned to the pine in a different way. Documented, photographed, and lodged in institutional custody. I closed the journal, sealed the cover with nails and redaction tape, and left the burned page, photograph, and manifest with the archive. I tightened the strap on my satchel, slid the brass compass back into its loop, and walked back toward the cabin where Harlan and Tommy were waiting. The pinus bark was dry under my palm. The chapter ended with an action. I locked the cabin door behind me, turned the deadbolt, and placed my hand flat on the wood, as if to feel its solidity. That was the last physical event of the chapter, emotion root, suspicion. I felt suspicion in the first sentences, and it motivated every careful action I took, shifting into alarm, then determination, anger, dread, resolve, and finally a watchful resignation. The last 2 days of work had been concrete. We bandaged, photographed, logged, and transferred. We argued and lost arguments and made decisions none of us wanted to make. The mimics means pages pinned, voices repeated, radio hijacked, are now catalogued by the archive. Whether that stops the thing is not a poetic question I can answer. It is a procedural one I have handed over to the people who can follow paper trails and sub-poeners. I will not read the journal aloud again. I recorded the events, sealed the evidence, and handed over the book to the registrar. I hammered a final staple through the canvas wrap and wrote on the manifest. Evidence transferred, logbook sealed, samples sent for analysis. The final concrete beat. The registrar closed the foam-lined crate, latched it, and slid it into the transport van. Harlan drove the van down the lane as the archives team radioed their arrival time. I watched the taillights until they disappeared into the trees. I stayed behind with Tommy and Harlan. We sat at the kitchen table in silence, and ate canned beans warmed over the lantern. We did not speak the clause. We spoke of names, times, and the steps we would take if the inquiry revealed more pinned pages. We agreed on procedures and wrote them down. Harlan grumbled but complied. Tommy slept in the cot and did not say anything until evening when Lena called and told me the ledger had produced a partial match to a name in a closed file from 5 years prior. We'll follow it. Lena, thank you for your restraint, Ailey. I closed the last page of my station notes and tucked the copy of the manifest under the brass compass. Then I walked outside and touched the pine where the page had been pinned and was gone now. I left a small staple in the bark as a marker of what had been removed. The action was simple and concrete. A notation, not a prayer. The chapter is complete. The logbook is sealed, the pinned pages are inventoried, and an institutional review has begun. The mimic remains a threat, but its artifacts are now evidence, and evidence can be tracked. I did what I could to turn a dangerous curiosity into a documented trail. I am not safe in any romantic sense. I am simply in custody of facts. I will keep a watch and continue to log, describe, and refuse to give voice to any last clause. I ended the day by driving a small nail through the corner of a sealed envelope and tacking it under my desk, where the evidence manifest copy lay. Then I turned the deadbolt and sat with the lantern on the table. Harlan snored softly in the chair. Tommy's breathing was steady. I closed my eyes for a moment, then opened them and wrote a single line at the top of the next page. Do not speak these words aloud. Log and seal any fragments found. That note is the final, practical instruction I leave in this chapter. The investigation will move forward. The logbook is in the archive's custody. I remain at Outpost 3 to guard what I can. The burned page now sits in institutional hands rather than dangling in a pine. I will continue to trace edges and record events. The last concrete act of the chapter is the locking of a crate and the signature on a manifest. Miriam signed the form. I signed the form. The van drove away. The forest returned to the ordinary business of birds and wind. I made coffee, wrote the next day's patrol list, and sealed another envelope. That morning's last action, nailing the envelope shut and tucking it under the desk, was both an ending and a promise. I will keep records, and I will not speak the last words aloud.